this is Terrence McNally, and first of all, I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. The better and the darker angels of our nature see this current breakdown and loss of what passes for normal life as an opportunity. What will we make of our shared confrontation with this virus? What stories will we tell ourselves? Can we come out the other side with a story of shared vulnerability, shared fate, shared purpose? I think this conversation with Jeremy Lent, recorded in 2018, lays a good foundation for asking those questions. In his book, The Patterning Instinct, Lent reminds us we see the world through stories, and the right has dominated politics with a story of America that is false on many counts and based on a set of values that brings us to this moment when we cannot work together to save our lives. Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to another newly recorded episode of Freeform, a world that just might work. I'll be joined today by Jeremy Lent, who in a past life took an internet company public, and then he set about the research that has resulted in his book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. After hosting and producing this show for nearly 2 decades, in 2014 I stopped recording new live interviews. And the show continued on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn, streaming relevant interviews from the archives. And podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on iTunes, Podomatic.com, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or A World That Just Might Work, all one word, .com. And they're both the same website. But with the election of Donald Trump, I couldn't resist exploring the path forward. I said, what is it I do? And this is something I do. And so this is the 26th such interview that I've recorded. It includes Paul Hawken on climate change and Naomi Klein on her book, No Is Not Enough, David K. Johnston on the daily dirty work of the Trump administration, and so on. And you can find them. They are all available on my website, terrencemcnally.net, and on iTunes. And at the start of the show, I always like to offer a few websites for information on how to participate in resistance to Trump and the movement forward toward a healthy and just future, the one we need. And you can email me at temcnally@mac.com if you want to get these websites and more information like that. But here they are, Indivisible Guide, one word, indivisibleguide.com. That's a national kind of collection of about 5,000 local groups, and perhaps the biggest and most organized of the organizing groups. Our Revolution, one word, ourrevolution.com. That's the group that grew out of the Bernie Sanders campaign. MoveOn.org, longtime digital activism site, which has been since the Trump election, coordinating more closely with on-the-ground grassroots organizations. So that's MoveOn.org. And then in California, similarly, Courage Campaign, one word, couragecampaign.org. Also, longtime digital activists now working closer with folks on the ground. And 2 sort of more specific ones, 5calls.org. That's the number 5 and the word calls, 5calls.org, which tells you the most relevant and timely phone calls you might be recommended to make to your representatives. And finally, townhallproject, one word.com, which tells you when your local representatives might be holding town halls if you want to go and let them know how you feel so they can represent your views. Now to today's guest. As I've mentioned, I've been narrowing my focus a bit in these new interviews. More often, they've been overtly political or focused on political change. And another theme that shows up a lot is the power of story and narrative. And I'm consciously looking for the narratives that make sense of Trump's electoral college victory and narratives that will help us to respond and to move forward. When I initially considered today's guest, Jeremy Lent, I knew he was playing with big ideas over long time spans. His subtitle is A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. Okay? Big stuff. But I did not realize initially how practically relevant he may be. Then I read these words in some of his writing. In recent decades, the right wing has not won on the issues, but by repeatedly telling a grand story of America. It's a story that is false on many counts and based on a set of values that are driving our civilization to a precipice. But it's been successful because there has been no coherent counter-narrative to override it. Sound familiar? And further, quote, We need a new story of our civilization based on humane values. This story would incorporate initiatives like universal health care and a higher minimum wage, but it must look beyond those towards a grander scope, a future of sustainable flourishing for all. In the patterning instinct, Lent brings together cultural history with neuroscience, a new discipline he calls cognitive history. And I'll let Lent share his own ideas, but let me just give you a sense of the territory. Lent suggests that from infancy, our minds are shaped by the culture we grow into, which lays trails we learn to follow, like paths through a field of tall grass. And helping us to construct these patterns of meaning are powerful root metaphors embedded in our thinking and our language. And without our conscious knowledge, they guide the choices we make. Okay, so the new story will need to offer inviting, compelling, and satisfying root metaphors that will then enable a new worldview. Jeremy Lent is founder of the nonprofit Leology Institute. I'll spell that Liology, the Leology Institute, which is at leology.org. It's dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the earth. Lent received a BA in English Literature from Cambridge University, an MBA from University of Chicago. As I said earlier, he founded an internet startup, took it public. He's the author of a novel, Requiem of the Human Soul, as well as The Patterning Instinct. And you can learn more at Jeremy Lent, JeremyLent, one word, jeremylent.com, and at leology.org. Welcome, Jeremy Lent, to Freeform, a world that just might work. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Tuesday, March 20th, 2018.
Well, thank you so much, Terence. It's a pleasure to be on the show and talking with you today.
Very good. So, as you may know, I often ask folks about their path, and I'm definitely asking you that question because it doesn't seem like 20 years ago you sat down to write books. You know what I mean? You had another life, and then something happened, and you said, this is what I'm called to do. This is what I've got to figure out. So tell us the story of your path, and be free to mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I grew up in England. Some people may wonder about my accent because it's kind of hard to place, but actually I was born and raised in England. And I left there in 1981 when I was 21. I just graduated from Cambridge University. And back in those days, I had quite a radical perspective on things. In fact, I was living in a squat for a year or two when I was actually in Cambridge protesting against the homelessness there. And I actually wanted to leave England because I just thought it was this colonial power still. It was living in the past. It was just beginning to enter the Thatcher era. And I thought, well, I wanted to go to a place that was really open-minded, where I could learn new things and explore new possibilities. And ironically, that it was America that I ended up in because I sort of I'd grown up in my teens in these kind of videos of Woodstock and things like that. I thought, that's the place I want to go to. Little did I know I was about to enter Ronald Reagan's era.
Yeah.
But in fact, I married somebody. She passed away some years back now. My first wife. But she had been a hippie, and she'd been traveling all over South America, and she had two sons that she wanted to give the best opportunities in their life. So I kind of agreed with her, even though we both had different kind of values, to actually enter what we called the belly of the beast, to sort of go into the sort of corporate capitalist paradigm, if you will, really with the idea of just kind of getting enough together to give a good education to my two stepsons and then sort of move on from there. And what ended up is I spent a big chunk of my life almost feeling like I was a spy, if you will, because I never bought into the values, but I lived and acted out those values. And in fact, I started an internet company back in the days of the first internet boom, took it public, and it was a success at the time. for at least for a few years. And it's difficult to confess right now from this point, but it was the first company ever to allow people to apply for a credit card online and get approved online, and you could design your own card. And so there I was helping to perpetuate one of the, really, as I look back on it, one of the worst pathologies of our modern society, like consumer debt, and the whole thing. And one thing that did to me is it gave me a sense of how people in that sphere rationalize their own behavior, which maybe we can come back to at some point in this discussion. But for me, what actually happened was in a few short years, all that crashed around me. My first wife began to get seriously ill, and I left the company to look after her full time. But the company, even though it had gone public, it wasn't really fully stabilized, and it crashed within a couple of years. My first wife began to have significant cognitive decline, so even though I looked after her for a lot of years before she passed, I really lost her relationship, and it felt like all the things I'd built my life around had crashed around me.
That's right. If I may jump in, it's even the compromise you made to flourish in the belly of the beast was a compromise you'd made based on the family you created with the woman you were losing.
That is so true. It was really like, what is there that I will do with my life going forward? And there was a sense of despair because it was pretty terrifying going through these years and quite alone, too. And at the same time, it felt like I had some real freedom in my life. Like, here I was still young in my life and able to do something that was meaningful. But where did meaning come from? And I was determined not to just accept what other people told me was meaningful. This was a path I wanted to, I was going to find for myself what was truly meaningful in life. And as such, it led me to start to sort of peel the onion, if you will, on our received ideas, and just ideas about what humans are and the preconceptions of our modern society. But then looking back, where did these ideas come from? Started to look at concepts of the soul or Christianity, and where did that come from, and what alternative ways are there. And one of the things that I got really stuck on is I wanted it to be a truly valid, believable cognitive research. So I read a lot of science, and I read these scientists like Richard Dawkins telling me that ultimately life is essentially meaningless and we're all just selfish. And I just didn't believe that. It just didn't make sense to me. And a lot of what my research was about was to find ways to find a true sense of where meaning was in life that could actually be one that I could believe in my gut and my heart and soul and my reason. And so all of that led to the research that led to this book, The Patterning Instinct, and really a cultural history of humanity to search the meaning, because that was what I was trying to trace. It was like a big detective journey over a number of years. And I'm fortunate, really, in my own life that I did come to a place that I feel now has brought me to a place of meaning in my life.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is for folks who don't know the book, The Patterning Instinct. It is a big book. It has a lot of notes, but the notes don't start till we're into 400 pages, and it's a story, isn't it? As well as a mystery, it's a story.
It's true. It very much is, and I did really want to write it as a kind of a detective story, because that's what I was going through over the years, and it was really the book was written for myself as I was at that time. It's really written for anyone who wants to really try to figure out for themselves, where do these different ideas come from? How does it all fit together? And are there alternative worldviews to the one that we're living in right now that we're told we just kind of take for granted, or even implicitly, we're not even told it is a worldview. It's just what the world is.
That's right.
And so I really wanted it to be kind of an enjoyable journey of discovery as we go through these stories. So it's not like dry philosophy.
Right.
It's like the story of where these ideas actually happened, where they came from, how they changed, and how they've affected history.
Right. And one thing you say is that you wrote the book that you would have wanted to be able to read at that point where you were in despair but free, right?
Exactly, because I kept searching for that book. I was going, well, how? There's got to be an answer to this question and that question, it was certainly a hugely enjoyable and energizing adventure, sort of to look into these ideas and try to understand them. But it did occur to me, wow, it would be so useful if somebody could actually piece these things together like this kind of jigsaw puzzle.
Let me ask you something which I wouldn't normally ask, but one of the great things about having an hour for a conversation allows me to ask questions like this. What were some of the books in that period that 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 set off light bulbs that you said, "Wow, this isn't the whole thing, but boy, what were some of the if you're climbing
Oh,
a mountain,
wow,
what were some of the
yeah.
what were some of the
Well,
rocks you found as you were climbing up that gave you, a view to
sure.
the next rock?"
Yeah, I love that question. And, the big challenge for me in answering that is not to turn it into a whole hour-long hour-long response. But maybe I'd say perhaps the most important of the things I came across was work by Fritjof Capra, who I'm truly honored ended up writing the foreword for this book.
Absolutely.
And he wrote that book. A lot of people may know him from a book he wrote way back when in the 70s called The Tao of Physics, which was really the first book to kind of explore the overlaps between modern science and traditional wisdom. But then he wrote some other books in the decades since. One's called The Web of Life, and I think one's called something like The Turning Point.
Well,
And
let me jump in. Another one
sure,
is called Hidden Connections, which certainly fits with what you're doing.
right,
But The Turning Point, which he wrote in 1981, is
yes.
one of those books for me. When I read The Turning Point, and for people that don't know it, go to my website or iTunes and look up my interview with Fritjof Capra, because when I interviewed
Mm,
him, even though it was much later, I think it was when he'd written the book on Leonardo science, I said, no, let's talk about The Turning Point, because what I read, by the way, was one of a few paragraphs from the opening of The Turning Point, and I said that could be written today, only he'd written it in 1981. I highly recommend
yes.
that book to anyone.
Yes, so glad to hear that, and I'm so glad you had the chance to have him on and interview him. Amazing person, and a really beautiful, warm-hearted person
Mm-hmm.
too, as well as being so insightful. And what he did for me in that book was lead me to this path of recognizing how science and deep sense of spiritual meaning could be actually integrated. And the key to that integration is the systems view of life. Basically, all the different sciences like complexity theory, systems biology, and network theory, all these sciences of connection that look not just this, don't just take this scientific reductionist path of saying basically we're all just little bits and elements and selfish genes, etc., but looks at the science of how things connect up. And as I was doing more of this work, I was coming across, I was getting more deeply involved in traditional Chinese thought. And another of the great seminal books I came across was actually written by a very famous radical thinking Chinese historian, sinologist called Joseph Needham, who wrote in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And he was really the first person to re-look at Chinese civilization, to get out of the old Western paradigm that these Chinese were backward and sort of medieval and conservative in their approach, and look at how they really made sense of the world. And what I found so fascinating is when you looked at things like Taoism and what was a philosophy that really integrated Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism about 1,000 years ago, called Neo-Confucianism. When you looked at these philosophies, what I saw was they had the same way of making sense of the world that modern systems thinking did. They looked at the connections between things. And of course, they weren't taking a modern scientific approach, but they were applying deep wisdom and looking at a world that was utterly different from the Western dualistic split world. And that was something that's led me to really been a big chunk of the sort of path I've taken in my life, is looking at how these things integrate, how we can integrate traditional wisdom and modern systems science and other scientific insights today to look at a more integrated worldview that could actually replace the current one that's leading us to destruction.
You said that a big part of what you're trying to do in your own life, in the book and so on, is integrate science and the metaphysical, or the mystical, or the pre science sort of relationship to the earth. One thing that has struck me is that we look back on the fact that Galileo was scorned, punished, ignored, etc., for X number of years when he said, that the Earth was not the center of the universe and so on. And we look on that and we go, how could they have been so foolish? It's obvious, and yet yet we are over a century past the time when science clearly saw in relativity, in quantum physics, in these things, the connectedness of everything, and yet scientists know it, science knows it, and as I say, if you get up in the morning and look outside or look into the eyes of a child, you know it, that everything is alive and connected, and yet we have been able to keep that from actually being the map or the path we use to actually act in the world. Any response to that?
Yes, yeah, you raised some really big, profound questions there, Terence. And I guess the one thing I would say is that I totally agree with you that some of those physicists back a century ago were the ones recognizing this way in which we're utterly interconnected with the world. In fact, when we look at nature, we're not even looking at nature, we're looking at nature as it responds to our inquiry, as they put it. And yet, that's still just a small fragment within the scientific community. Because if you look at the way that most scientists view the world, they view it using this fundamental metaphor that I see as being part of our modern worldview, and one that's been shown to be false. Is that nature basically is a machine. And they don't just think that nature is like a machine. Many of them get stuck in actually believing nature is a machine. And that's one core centrality to the paradigm. And even among what is so fascinating is that the branch of science that should be the one most recognizing nature as being a living entity, which is biology, the actual study of life, is the one it almost got some sort of inferiority complex through the 18th and 19th centuries as physics and chemistry got to be so powerful by looking at nature as a machine. And they're the ones who got really stuck on this machine metaphor now. So the irony is that the physicists are only too aware of the sort of unbearable complexity of the universe as it is, and how we can never really, as soon as we try to look at one thing, it becomes something else. And the biologists are the ones who get so stuck in this notion of looking at things basically like they sort of talking about DNA as software, or talking about the mind as software and the body as hardware. And all of these metaphors they use are essentially looking at humans and life as being big computers and machines, which are fundamentally flawed, and that leads to potential disasters if we continue to make sense of things in that way.
And add something, because I've certainly followed that as well, that biology had been the observational science. It had been the science of naturalists, the science of looking at nature and seeing how it connected. And then, as you say, when physics started getting more results and, let's be clear, more funding, the Rockefeller Foundation was really quite responsible for the move to microbiology, which was basically biology as physics. And we haven't unwrapped ourselves from that yet.
Yes, I think that's true. And one of the things I look at it in my book, I actually have a chapter towards the end looking at this kind of systems view of life as an alternative paradigm. And to some degree, I do see this kind of clash of paradigms between this view of life and the universe and humans and the earth as being connected, and this reductionist dominant view of everything as being separate. In a way, that is a clash of paradigms that will determine the future of humanity on the earth.
The conventional Western worldview might see reality as dead, separate, and static, a machine, and I have long experienced reality as being alive, interdependent, and dynamic. And it's just...
Exactly. And what's so interesting is it's not just the difference between our own subjective interpretation and what science, sort of capital S, tells us, but that is actually false science. What findings of the past few decades in systems understanding of life, systems biology, complexity theory, and everything, is that subjective experience of being really connected with everything is actually what is real. And when scientists tell us that, well, we're all just driven by selfish genes, and humans are actually selfish, and even looking at our identity as being this kind of adamantine sort of fixed barriers between us and other things around us, all of these things have been shown to be just not the case. And in a lot of ways, what we see is reductionist science, because it's been so successful in applying its findings to technology and essentially, in many ways, taking over the world that we're used to, has taken this technical success into what's called sort of an ontological frame. And so because it makes sense to look at nature as a machine and break things down and you can understand them better, that means that this is what the universe is. That means that this is what life is.
That's right.
And that's where they make this terrible mistake.
It's confusing your tool with your reality.
Yes.
Reductionism, as it's used by science, is a very successful tool, but it's not reality. Let's jump back a bit, Jeremy, to the way you actually frame things in the book. What is what you name the book after? What do you consider to be the patterning instinct?
Yes, so I see the patterning instinct as the instinct that really makes humans unique among other mammals. It's an instinct that we have to a far greater degree than other mammals, even though they also have this patterning instinct. It's something that arises really from our highly developed prefrontal cortex in our brain, which kind of connects things up in ways that allow us to sort of, not just allows us, but drives us to find meaning into everything else around us. And you can see this kind of instinct, like just in a newborn baby, who, as she's born, she begins to sort of hear all these sounds around her, and over the months connect them up with movements and things that happen to her, and she begins to develop the capability to understand language. And nobody tells her, hey, you're meant to do this and figure out what we're saying, but she does that by instinct, and that's a patterning instinct at work.
Okay.
And if you look back in history at when humans first evolved as modern humans, they applied that instinct to the world around them, this kind of otherwise kind of chaotic stuff that was going all around, and put some kind of frames of meaning around it. And it's a patterning instinct that drives this need that humans have and cultures have to frame meaning into the world.
Now, I often talk about how we tend to develop narratives to explain our experience. Is this pretty similar?
I think it's very similar, and it's also slightly different because there's a lot of people talking nowadays in the progressive community about the need for a new story. And, the old story is the one that's driving us to destruction. We need a new story to replace it. I completely agree. And, I do see my work as sort of being part of that work towards that new story. But in a way, looking at things from this perspective of frames of meaning and these root metaphors that we use to make sense of the universe, is a little bit like the framework that is needed for the new story to arise in. So I do see my work as a little bit like is providing kind of the frames from which the new story or new stories can emerge. And these are stories that are stories based on a sense of connectedness rather than a sense of separation.
Hello, this is Terrence McNally, and you're listening to my 2018 conversation with Jeremy Lent about the ideas in his book, The Patterning Instinct. If you will, take a few minutes, feel free to take maybe up to 5 minutes to sort of talk about some of that cultural history. The hunter-gatherers, the Greeks, the Christians. Take us through a little bit about how those
Sure.
those patterns, those worldviews have evolved.
Sounds great, Terrence. So, let's see if I can do the briefest history of the world and humanity in 5 minutes.
Come on, Monty Python could make a 5-minute
is...
video that would do it, right?
Exactly. So, just to really take you up on that offer, so when we did develop that first patterning instinct, we spent really 95% of human history as nomadic hunter-gatherers. And the core metaphor that our ancestors used to make sense of the world was really seeing nature as like a giving parent. They didn't see boundaries between things. They saw themselves as having spirits, and everything in nature was spirit, and everything was in constant transformation. And, if nature and their giving mother and father didn't give them enough food in one place, they just moved to the next place, and there was something else. And then this big shift happened, maybe the biggest shift in all of human history, with the rise of agriculture, about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And with that, maybe even more than the agriculture itself, was people staying in one place. And when you stay in one place, a lot of things change. All of a sudden, possessions which have no value for nomadic hunter-gatherers become all important. And you put fences up, and you work hard on preparing your fields to cultivate your crops, and you want to put fences up to keep nature out and to keep other humans out too. And then inequalities start developing. People start to earn more, make more, more than others, either because they got lucky or they worked harder. So then they can start hiring other people. They don't want other people to get the benefits of their hard work. And that led not just to hierarchies and inequality and wealth, but also to the patriarchy, because suddenly you cared about making sure that your sons would inherit what you put together. And women, rather than being really just equal parts of what got done, became these kind of possessions that you got to use to establish your lineage. So with agriculture, you got to see these increasing shifts in inequalities, really for the last 10,000 years. And different big civilizations started to arise which then formed different ways of making sense of things. And I see this big split between what arose in East Asia and traditional Chinese thought, which really saw, it kind of took the hunter-gatherer view of seeing things as connected, but applied it systematically in a very powerful way to see really humans as living in this kind of harmonic web of life. And in the West...
Let me interrupt for 1 second here. So we're seeing this divergence between the West and the East. Is the East taking on agriculture, but not taking on the worldview the West took from agriculture?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Really, all the early civilizations were based on agriculture and based on agrarian values, including things like hierarchy, patriarchy, and you see that just as much in China, as you see it in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Aztec civilization around the world. So there are some commonalities that all the great early civilizations had, and at the same time, they all began to go their own unique ways from that shared sort of base set of values, forming their own sense of things. So that's where, traditional China is every bit as hierarchical, patriarchal, if not more so than other cultures. But within that, they began to form a worldview that was still based on a sense of connectedness. And it was really only in Europe, with the ancient Greeks, and then European, essentially Christianity and European civilization going forward from them. So you see this big split that happens in human thought. And they conceived of the world as being this kind of split cosmos. It's a rise of dualism, the sense of there being some eternal dimension of the universe somewhere out there that was perfectly good and unchanging, and the world was this polluted place. And humans themselves became split between a soul and a body. And the body was really like this kind of prison for the soul that was eternal, that wanted to get back to that eternal place.
And you point out that
Greek,
you point out that Plato, which is what you're getting to right now. I remember when I went to college, I took Humanities 101. It was a gen ed requirement, and we started with Plato.
Yes. And in fact, there's one famous philosopher who said that essentially all of Western philosophy is nothing other than a series of footnotes to Plato, which actually is so true. As I discovered through my own research, there's a lot of truth in that, because this sense of dualism, the sense of mind-body split, is something that all of the whole Christian worldview came from that, the sense of God and the earth down below, and the sense that it's your soul that is eternal, etc. And that led to modern scientific thought. And that's what's so funny, that we see this split nowadays between science and religion, as though they're two fundamentally separate worldviews. But what I discovered, and I trace in my book, is that actually modern science arose in the incubator of European Christianity. And it arose because they had the same sense of the belief in this divinity of reason. And through reason, we can understand the universe. And in fact, those early scientists like Galileo, Newton, and the rest of them thought that through their science, they were actually being able to read the mind of God. They could actually see the mind of God through the way science works, because their reason was what God gave us to sort of connect with the divine.
And isn't the notion of natural law as being basically God's law?
Yes, that's exactly what it was. And in fact, it was Kepler who was the first person who said, I see my life mission is to understand what God's law is in terms of how it's shown into our natural laws. And even the ancient Greeks, the very word astronomy actually comes from the words meaning the law of the stars. So there's this sense that somehow the Creator gave laws, and it's humans' job to understand what those laws are. And the sense of law gives a sense of this fixity, the sense that everything is fixed in the universe, and it's just for humans to sort of figure out what those laws are and then stick with it.
One moment in the evolution of Christianity, because it seems to me that if one goes back and actually reads the New Testament, that there was a fair amount of connectedness and a fair amount of we're all in this together, as well as mysticism. And my reading, taken from Elaine Pagels, was the first one who clued me into this, is that when Christianity became state religion with the conversion of Constantine, and became, rather than the religion of a bunch of, progressives and revolutionaries wandering around, and became the authoritarian religion, that's when it such things became as the dualism between man and nature, and the put down of nature and sex and all became stronger. Is that your reading as well?
Well, I have. I think that's true, and at the same time, I come from a slightly different place, because one of the things I look at is how monotheism itself has this kind of dualistic split within it, of this sense. It also leads to the sense of really intolerance, that any kind of monotheistic way of making sense of the world says that, there's only one God, and therefore our view must be right, and those who don't agree must be basically heretical and wrong.
Let's remember, that is the first commandment.
Exactly.
There may be 10, but that's the first one.
That's exactly right. And then even when you look at earlier versions of monotheism before the Old Testament, you really just see a couple of them. One is there's an ancient Egyptian ruler called Akhenaten who tried to impose monotheism. And then there was Zarathustra,
Mm-hmm.
who started Zoroastrian religion, which is also monotheistic. And both of those are really the only examples in ancient history of massive political intolerance arising from a theology, from a belief in how the world actually works.
Yeah.
So I actually have a chapter devoted to looking at what I call the scourge of monotheistic intolerance through history.
Yeah. Oh, listen. I mean, everyone else must be wrong if there's only one and they've never heard of it.
Exactly. So, in a way, what I see was Christianity becoming the sort of mainstream thinking was this kind of integration or synthesis between the dualistic thought that the ancient Greeks had before Christianity, and then this really more systematic way of making sense of the world that Christianity offered, which essentially was like a bit of a democratization of dualism.
Mm-hmm.
Because until then, Plato and those who followed, the Neoplatonists, would talk about how you can only get to this place of bliss through years of applied meditation and really separation from the body, whereas Christianity said, look, all you need is faith. Just believe in this God, believe in Jesus Christ as the incarnation. That's it.
And then we can get on with it. We can get on with all that dualism allows us. And then what you say, as you mentioned earlier, is that science, Descartes and those folks, actually, they grew out of the Christian dualism, the Christian separation from nature, and the sort of it became the duty of humans to subject nature to its will to serve God.
That's right. And so that's where Christianity really was this incubator for modern science, because if the source of holiness and sacredness is out there in the heavens in God, that means nature itself has just been put there for human stewardship or human dominion, as it said in Genesis. So then when scientists wanted to do whatever they wanted to do with the natural world, that was fine. It was there for them to do, whereas other ways of looking at basically at nature, and East Asian ways or other indigenous ways, saw nature itself as being sacred, as having some intrinsic value. And a big chunk of these last few hundred years of our modern worldview has arisen from the fact that nature is seen just as a resource for human consumption, not as having intrinsic value in its own right. Mm-hmm. And that all comes from the scientific worldview, which in itself emerged from that Christian dualistic worldview.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is lay out, we've sort of hinted around it, but I want to be very explicit, that the worldview that underpinned the scientific revolution, which brought us the marvels that science allowed us to do, but also brought us, as you say, catastrophic root metaphors that explain our current disastrous relationship to the living world, and then that there is an alternative, the science of the study of complex systems. If you could just make that distinction very explicit.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Terence. And so as I look at the underlying root metaphors of these last few hundred years, what we see is that they were based in that scientific revolution starting in the 17th century. And the core metaphors that we see are nature as a machine. And back in those days, it was like nature looked like this very intricate watch. Now we've just kind of morphed into nature as a sort of very clever computer,
exactly,
if you will.
Yep.
So that's one metaphor. The other was so powerful was conquering nature. Mm-hmm. And that got set up by Francis Bacon back in the 17th century. And it was this rallying cry. And at the time, if you were a progressive thinker, it would have been wonderful. Like, yes, we can do all these great things by understanding nature, and all these bad things happen. We can conquer nature. And so many generations of scientists were inspired by that idea. And it led to this kind of weird, bizarre separation of humans from nature, that rather than seeing humans as being part of nature, we're there to conquer nature, and it's just a machine anyway. And what makes us as humans unique is it used to be our soul, but then it became our mind. It was Descartes who really translated soul into mind for the modern sort of scientific worldview. And we see that to this very day, where we'll have people like say, Raymond Kurzweil, the technologist who works for Google right now, arguing that the singularity is near, who hopes that he can, in his words, download his own mind so that when his body dies, he can upload it to new hardware. So this bizarre concept of human existence itself as being this kind of software and hardware. And then you see it in when people look at the risks of climate disruption, and rather than going, we need to change the system which is causing our whole natural world to become unbalanced, they say, well, basically what we should do is look at nature as one gigantic thing to be engineered. Let's come up with geoengineering.
Yep.
And, if our climate's off, well, just like any other machine, we'll just put it right again ultimately for the benefit of the gigantic consumer corporate machine that is essentially based on taking nature and monetizing it, and taking human activity and monetizing it, which has to be allowed to go on above all else. So those are some, and that's where it's so important to see that science and monotheism have this shared dualistic split within them. And I do believe that the alternative to that is not then to reject science or to reject progress, but actually to recognize that that really good quality science sees these connections between things and looks at how ecologies arise and looks at our interconnectedness and recognizes as human beings, it's our ways in which we're connected with others that form our values, and that we basically have nature within us. We're not separate from nature. We are nature. And by that recognition, it allows us both to connect with some of the greatest insights of traditional wisdom from Buddhist, Taoist, and even other alternative Western minds that had similar kind of views, and to connect that up with modern scientific understanding to really come up with a worldview that could offer a more sustainable path.
Mm-hmm. And let me jump on one thing there, which is in one article I read, you wrote of the warning to humanity offered by 15,000 scientists from 184 countries that were facing, quote, widespread misery, catastrophic biodiversity loss, and that time is running out. Soon it will be too late to shift course from our failing trajectory. Now, this warning actually just echoed another one that had been issued by scientists 25 years earlier. They were both basically ignored. This is not front page news. This is back page news. How do you explain a society that relies on science for its technology, its engineering, its medicine, every new gadget or gimmick that it sets out to sell and use, and yet it ignores scientists when they talk about the big picture?
That is such a great question. And I think the only way we can really explain it is by recognizing that our society is driven not by science, but is driven by this gigantic transnational capitalist corporate machine that got put in motion around the same time as the scientific revolution, with this notion of corporations. And it's as though we actually set a form of artificial intelligence up in the world that is taking over our human consciousness. And this AI, this artificial intelligence, is in fact the sort of the corporate structure that is designed to just use the natural resources to maximize shareholder value. And that in itself becomes a self-propagating power. So when we look at what the media decides people should be hearing about, it's not based on a sense of, well, what's true or what's important for humanity. It's based on, well, what will sell the most advertising, what will keep our investors happiest. And ultimately, we just need to recognize that even the media, as well as all the other industries we're looking at, are owned by gigantic transnational corporations who have no ultimate objective other than to increase their shareholder value, regardless of any ethical considerations.
Yes, I long have said that when the most powerful guiding institutions have no soul,
right,
that it's going to be difficult for your society to allow the soul to thrive.
I think that's just so true, Terence. And, something I find so ironic, and it would be funny if it weren't so tragically powerful, is this notion of corporate personhood. That, that the law says that corporations are persons, which gives them this incredible power that they would otherwise not have. And of course, if corporations were persons, they would be pathological.
Absolutely.
What you'd really be looking at is sociopaths and psychopaths, because when you have a human who desires nothing other than power, and they're ready to, it doesn't matter to them, they have no sense of empathy, no sense of compassion, and they'll do anything that's required in order to maximize that one goal. Well, we recognize those people, for starters, of course, because our society is the way it is, those are often the people who end up as the CEOs of our major transnational corporations and maintain that same machine. But when they're less powerful in the world and they're discovered to be that way, they end up basically being sent away from life because they're the kinds of people who are willing to kill for nothing other than their own gain.
Right, and one thing that also you point out is that corporations, that if one could look at the corporate mind, and the corporate mind says self-preservation is my goal, and if I follow these behaviors, I will prevail. That if they do that based on their worldview, this is the worldview of the corporation, they are immortal.
That's right.
So they don't in other words, there is some countervailing force in human beings about the fact that we are not immortal, and we will degrade and we will die, and that probably creates some different approach to things, but the corporation doesn't have that.
Yes, I think you're right about that. And so they're theoretically immortal, and they're not subject to any country's laws. So, the big transnational corporations, they're the ones who dictate terms to other countries. And they say, well, we'll put this plant in this country because they have the weakest labor laws, and we'll choose this polluting plant to put them in that country because they have the weakest pollution laws. And so essentially it's this kind of race to the bottom that they're able to create among countries around the world, leading to these massive inequalities that we see today in the world, unlike anything in all of history, where the numbers are just unbelievable. The wealthiest 6 men in the world right now own as much wealth as the entire lower half of the world population. Yeah. Like 3.75 billion people.
Yeah. No, it's as crazy as ancient rulers, Nebuchadnezzar, you name it, we've put them in the dust. Let's turn, we've got about 6 minutes left. Let's turn to the solution. You say that by recognizing our underlying values are inherited from previous generations, which is what your book does, which is what our conversation is talking about, we can become more conscious of them, and this allows us to choose our other values with the potential to lead to a flourishing future for humankind. How are we going to change those root metaphors? Has it happened before? Has it happened consciously? How long does it take?
Yes, great question, Terence. And I think that it is happening right now around the world. And the reason why we can have hope that we can change that root metaphor is it touches into our true human experience. Just as you were saying before, Terence, we kind of know as humans, as we grow up, that actually there is a different way of finding meaning. Even though we're told it's all about status and it's all about what we earn and we're all separate from each other, there are these feelings we have. That's not really the case. My friends, my family, you go out into nature and you feel this deep sense of connection. So what it's really about is recognizing that those deepest feelings we have as human beings are actually valid. And what is reason for hope is that there is this movement, a connected movement going on as we speak around the world of people in so many different areas, so many different parts of life, waking up to this and making those connections together. And I think that we are in the middle of really one of the greatest transformations of human experience. We talked earlier about the rise of agriculture and science as these two massive transformations in human history. And this century, I think we're undergoing a similar kind of transformation. There's a possibility this transformation could lead to the utter collapse of civilization. There's also a possibility it could lead to what I call a techno-split, where the affluent minority just really fortify themselves against the rest of the world that it endures the collapse of climate change and just sort of enjoys their own new technological enhancements, etc. But I do think there's a possibility that we can actually find a flourishing future for humanity as an interconnected family on the earth. But to do that requires a recognition that the economic system that is leading us to this destruction has to be fundamentally changed. And so, yeah, we've seen all kinds of amazingly powerful nonlinear phase transitions in social realities, whether it's something like the acceptance of same-sex marriage, whether something like the Me Too movement, which is really shifting power dynamics even as we speak. And I think what we need to do is to see how we can take that social transformation and apply that to an economic transformation to allow us a different path to relate to each other and the world.
And there are other models, the Mondragon cooperatives,
Exactly.
the way that a country like Costa Rica runs itself, the way the Nordic countries run themselves for the most part.
That's right. Those are the perfect models out there. The Mondragon cooperative is one of my favorite ones because it's this scalable. It shows that there in the Basque Country is this cooperative that's been successful for decades now with tens of thousands of people working there with different, it's like a whole ecosystem of its own. And it's based on a sense of cooperativeness. It's based on this recognition of dignity for each individual and everyone being part of a shared community. And it shows that that kind of approach is absolutely can apply anywhere in the world. It's just a matter of the political will and the moral will to make it happen.
So if I'm a listener, and this conversation resonates with me, and I've got these inklings. What do I do today, tomorrow, the next day?
Yeah, a great question, Terrence. And I think the first thing that I would suggest anybody does is really look at their own unquestioned assumptions in their worldview. And that's not so easy to do, but one of the things that we need to do is look at our own activities and say, where am I sort of buying into this destructive worldview that is leading us as humanity to the precipice and also potentially making my own life feel alienated and meaningless. And so there's an internal search that I think can develop. But just as important is that once we recognize ourselves as being part of this deeply interconnected, complex system of the earth, humanity all around us, is realizing that what we do actually makes a difference. And so realizing our engagement with social structures, with political structures, and realizing that any of us who enjoy some affluence are only doing that because of the rate at which we're destroying natural resources and because of the impoverishment of so much of the rest of the world. And really making a difference, realizing the implications of that lead to all kinds of choices we can make to take our part to make a difference, to transform that.
Very good. So again, the websites are jeremylent.com. That's Jeremy and then Lent, one word, jeremylent.com, and leology.org. We didn't talk about leology, but that is leology.org. Leology Institute is where you're attempting to study and pass on the bridging of science and wisdom, right?
Exactly, a more integrated worldview that could potentially enable a framework for human flourishing on the earth into the future.
Right, so a foundation, a context in which this new worldview can arise.
Exactly.
For this conversation and many other interviews, articles, transcripts of interviews, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. One more time, Terrence McNally, TerrenceMcNally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork, all one word.com. If you want to receive a weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 6-8 articles that are relevant to the moment, you can sign up at my site or email me at temcnally mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on iTunes. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at iTunes. Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Ariana Huffington, Greg Boyle, etc. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to G, my engineer, Mark Maxwell in production, and George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. Thank you, Jeremy Lent. Keep up the good work.
It's been a pleasure, Terrence. Thank you.